All right, so good morning or good afternoon, depending on where you're joining us from, everyone, today, and welcome to our Downey Wenjack Fund live event. My name is Jesse Hildebrand, and I will be your host for today. As we gather, we are reminded that throughout Canada, we are situated on Indigenous lands, both ceded treaty land and unceded land. This land is steeped in rich Indigenous history and home to many First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people today. As a country, we have a responsibility for the stewardship of the land on which we live and work, and so today I acknowledge the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation of the Anishinaabe, the Haudenosaunee, and the Neutral people on whose territory I'm broadcasting from today. The Gord Downey and Cheney Wenjack Fund is part of musician Gord Downey's legacy and embodies his commitment and that of both the Downey and Wenjack families to build cultural understanding and create a path towards reconciliation between Indigenous and non-Indigenous peoples. The goal of the Downey Wenjack Fund is to continue that conversation that began with Cheney Wenjack's residential school story and to support the reconciliation process through awareness, education, and action. Today's speaker is Dawn Hill, a member of the Mohawk Nation Turtle Clan from the Six Nations of the Grand River Territory. She is a registered social worker who currently works at the Six Nations Family Health Team, which is located in historical downtown Ohsweken, as a clinical social worker. Dawn grew up at the Tuscarora Reservation in Lewiston, New York. Dawn has been writing short story memoirs about her family and her time growing up with 13 siblings for the past 15 years. Memory Keeper is her first published collection. Dawn's stories depict anecdotes, however comedic or horrific, from her life on the res, and these stories helped her to circumnavigate constructively the residual pain and dysfunction that is the legacy of the residential school system. Without further ado, Dawn, thank you so much for joining us today, and take us away.
Yawa, Jesse, meaning thank you. Sego Seguego, Yungyats Dawn Hill, Yagaladus, Ganyagahaga Niwa Gazodin, Anola Niwa Dalodin, Tekidaran Ohsweken, Tuscarora Nundage, Waguweskune ne Agyado. So what I just said in Mohawk, which is Ganyagahaga, is hello everybody. My name is Dawn Cheryl Hill. I also like to tell stories. That's what Yagalados means. She tells stories. I am Mohawk. I am Turtle Clan. I live in Ohsweken. I come from Tuscarora, which is in Lewiston, and I like to write. So that's what I said in Mohawk. I am very grateful to be here, honored to share with you from my book. This is my book here. It's called Memory Keeper. And I wanted to share a story with you and maybe a poem. I also have a slideshow, but I don't know if we're going to get to that or not. So I'm going to just read the first chapter from my book. It's called Disassociation Part 1. And this is just a story, kind of a remembrance from back in 1979 when I was first gone away to college. I went to an all-girls college down in the Finger Lakes region of New York State. It was called Keuka College. So my mom and I sat across from each other at the table on an unseasonably warm Indian summer day in 1979. The dining room table sat at the far end of the living room. Behind the table was an oversized mahogany buffet that was chock full of my mom's beads and beadwork in various stages of completion. In the corner of the room was her matching mahogany curved glass china cabinet that held all her treasures. Our dining room table was so old, it probably could have qualified as an antique. It was a rectangular table with carved, spindly barley twist legs that were joined by a cross stretcher underneath. That probably gave it enough strength and stability to remain standing even after a family of 15 had gathered around it for hundreds of meals, if not thousands. It had whitened scorch marks on the top where someone sat down a hot pan. On one side of the table was a bench that my father had engineered many years before I was even born. It was made of 2x4s with some type of rough hewn planks nailed on top with the apron on each side. At one time it was painted John Deere green, but you could barely see that as the wood and paint had been worn smooth and shiny by all the children seated upon it over the years. None of the chairs matched, and whatever fabric upholstery that once covered the seat of my chair was long gone. I could feel something crinkly underneath my legs as I sat there in my jeans and Oxford button-down blouse. I was home for a weekend from Keuka College, an all-girls college in the Finger Lakes region of New York. I was working on a paper about trauma, and I wanted to ask my mother all about her experiences when she was in the mush hole as a child. At that time, I wasn't aware of the official name it went by, the Mohawk Institute. I only knew that everyone called it the mush hole. I had my pen in hand and a notebook ready to fill with all my mother's reminiscence about her time as a child, interned there with her two sisters. She never spoke of it, so I wasn't sure which two sisters were with her at the mush hole. It was probably about 10:30 on a Saturday morning. My mom had been up for a while and was sitting at the table beading. Her long salt and pepper hair was braided and pinned up behind her head. That morning it was a little unruly and wisps of it stood up around her face. My mom was once a beauty, but after birthing and raising 10 children and living a life full of hard knocks, she looked older than her 54 years. She had on an orange paisley patterned house dress and a pair of brown polyester pants underneath it. I'm sure her sister, Mary, had made the pants for her. The Moo Moo might have been a creation of my Auntie Pen, that was her nickname too. My mom, Hazel Leona Van Every Hill, was born on the Six Nations Reservation in Ohsweken, Ontario in 1925. She was the eldest of 10 children born to Titus Van Every and Vera Beulah Thomas. My mom shared the same dark complexion of her father, as well as his rather prominent proboscis. Her grandpa Ty nose was passed on to my sister Dolores and my brothers David and Ty. I can imagine myself practically dancing down those stairs because I wanted to get a jump on this paper. I wanted to get it outlined, drafted, and hopefully ready to type up once I got back to Keuka. I sat down across from her, set my paper and pen down, and I started to explain that I had just completed a paper on the Jewish Holocaust for my diversity and oppression class. I mentioned how I wanted to write about her experiences at residential school. I wanted to contrast and compare her experiences with cultural and linguistic genocide to that of straight up genocide that the Jewish people experienced in Nazi Germany. I especially wanted to know how she and her sisters ended up at the mush hole, how long they stayed there, what she had learned, what happened, and what it was like. I began with a simple question. How old were you when you went there? At that moment, my mom changed before my eyes. She disappeared. Her eyes went blank, and it seemed like she suddenly had, or maybe always had, nictitating eyelids. Somehow I never noticed that before. It looked like this other membrane had unexpectedly swept across her eyes, and she no longer saw me or the room we sat in. I could imperceptibly hear a loud clang, like a gate was slamming shut around her. I continued to talk and kept asking questions, but she had morphed into that girl with the faraway eyes from the Rolling Stones song. I couldn't reach her anymore. It hit me like a sledgehammer. I was seeing someone dissociate. However, it wasn't in the midst of a therapy session. It was my mom. This was way too real and frightening. I thought it was all my fault. What I was studying at college and textbooks about psychological pathology had somehow led to this chicken coming home to roost. She was definitely disconnecting from her thoughts and possibly her own identity in that moment. I always believed my professor when she said that the mind is a very powerful thing. In that moment, it was giving my mom a way out. She had shut down, opted out, was emotionally detached. I felt the cold hand of fear on the back of my neck, and panic began to rise in me. My biggest fear was that I was never going to get her back. I called her name, Mom, Ma, Mama, but my voice didn't seem to register anywhere within her. I put my hand on her shoulder and she winced, flinched, and pulled away. Louder, I said, Mama, can you hear me? Slowly, she relaxed a little and she blinked. She looked at me, but she didn't say anything. I said her name again, and I asked if she was okay. It was taking her a little bit longer to process my question, my presence. I completely lost my desire to ask her any more questions. I didn't want to trigger more unpleasant or hurtful memories for her. She finally said she was okay, and then she picked up her needle and she continued to bead the edging on the barrette that she was working on. There was no more to say. All the questions I had were gone, left unasked. Whatever conversation we might have had was never to be. My concern for her emotional well-being far overshadowed my desire for answers in that moment. It's been over 40 years since I attempted to expose my mother's tenuous connection to the memories from her childhood. I never tried to dredge up her recollections again. Over time, a thought occurred to me. In her silence, was she protecting herself or was she protecting me? So my mother and her sisters were at what they called the mush hole. And the reason they called it the mush hole was because that's all they got. Morning, noon, and night was mush, oatmeal, nasty. Shh. Um, Sometimes with mealy worms in it that they had to eat, that they couldn't leave on their plates. So she was there from 1934 to 1940, from the time she was 9 years old to the time she was 16. I have 4 children. I just couldn't imagine what that must have been like to have your child taken from you. And my grandparents had 3 of them taken and put at this place called the Mush Hole. I want to share a poem with you. This is a poem that my oldest son, Jordan, he was 17 when he wrote it. He was a senior at the Niagara Wheatville High School, which is in Sanborn, New York, which is adjacent to the Tuscarora Reservation, which is where he grew up. Anyway, he wrote a poem about his Duda, that means grandmother in Mohawk, his Duda Hazel, for his writing class. He brought it home and he gave it to me and asked me to read it. And as I read it for the first time, tears welled up and fell from my eyes because it just made me think again about all that my mother had endured at her time at the mush hole. Things that I never knew about, things that I will never know about because my mother's been gone for 35 years now. I never did have a chance to ask her again, ever, about her time there. So this poem is called Mush Hole. Little Indian girl on a train to a school, so far, far away from the land of her life's blood. I am with her, and I am her, as are countless others, on a train to a school filled with notions of civilization and the sorrows of many nations, with secret meetings in closets, so we could talk that tongue that is our life's blood, so we could hold that dream in our hands of growing up free. But it was all overshadowed by civilization and brutal beatings and things we couldn't understand. Grandma never spoke those life-giving words ever again, nor have I. Jordan Welby Stiers, 2000. I did send this slideshow, this PowerPoint presentation. And Jesse, do we have enough time to go through it?
We have more than enough time. If you want to take a second after reading that, by all means, please do. Again, this has been a very personal and vulnerable program with us today. And so I want to stress personally, like, this has been absolutely beautiful. We have plenty of time for your program, and I'd love to share some of these pictures and stories with our students joining us live. So please do go ahead.
Do you want to take some questions now and then move on to the PowerPoint?
I find in these programs it's always good to save everything for the end. I think it gives people a chance to sort of percolate on all of it, as opposed to throwing it in the middle. So if you would like to go ahead, I think that's best.
Okay. All right. So do you have it up on the screen now?
I have it up on the screen, and you just need to, on your end, you can switch slides whenever you'd like to any next picture or slide.
Okay. So the title, Woodland Cultural Institute, is what it's called now, this building in Brantford. Back when my mother was there, it's called the Mush Hole. It was called the Mohawk Institute. Oh. So this is a picture of the Mohawk Institute in Brantford. It was open in 1831 and it closed in 1970. There was a time when the people from the reserve here in Ohsweken, Six Nations, wanted it torn down. They wanted it razed, which means torn down, which sounds weird. Anyway, and so there was a kind of like a referendum that was put out there to make a decision what they wanted to do about this building. And they decided that they wanted to save the evidence. And that's what they call their campaign, to raise money to save the evidence that this residential school, was all about abuse and linguistic genocide, cultural genocide. And so it still stands today, and it's actually just been renovated, and they do tours through it as well. In September 30th, 2017 was the first time I ever went to the Mohawk Institute Woodland Cultural Center when they, had a program for Orange Shirt Day. And I got there, and some of the stories are in my book. One of the stories of that day was there's a museum to the left of that building, and I sat in the auditorium and I listened to a virtual tour, watched a virtual tour of the residential school, and that was pretty horrific, because while I was in that darkened theater alone, I saw a picture of my mother's signature on the wall. And that was really the first time that I had any confirmation that my mother was there, because in the past they always said she wasn't, that they had no record of her. And then that very same day, at the end of the day, one of the people who used to work there at the cultural center sent me this picture on my phone of my mother and this one. It looked like two mugshots, and my phone pinged as I was sitting in my car behind the mush hole that day. And I looked at these two pictures and I thought, who is that? I had never seen these pictures before. And when I looked at it, I thought it looked like my son. I thought it looked like my sisters. And my friend, who's now deceased, she texted me afterward and said, that's a picture of your mom as she was getting processed into the mush hole in 1934. So, of course, I did my calculations knowing that she was born in 1925, and I thought she was 9. And the one picture that I saw, when I blew it up with my finger on my phone, she had a fat lip, this one. You can see a fat lip there. It was quite a day. I felt pretty shattered that day. And I think that was the day that I decided that I was going to put all these stories together that I had been writing all along for quite a while. I called it, writing myself better. Whenever I felt down, I would just sit down and write a story. So these were the two pictures of my mother that I got that day. During this PowerPoint, these are some of the things that I want to look at. These are all things that impact contemporary First Nation people today. That Indian Act of 1876, which is all paternalistic and about taking most of our rights away from us and looking at us as less than. historical oppression. We'll go through all this: racism, discrimination. I call it linguistic genocide, cultural genocide. Another good word is ethnocide. Just trying to, kill the Indian, save the man kind of a mentality. Um, so the Indian Act first came into effect in 1876, and if you read this quote from John MacDonald, it was all about assimilating, forceful assimilation of, and getting rid of the Indian problem. There's 21 things that this Indian Act did. The first thing is it denied women's status, changed, you know, the government changed the way that Native people, view themselves. We have always been a matrilineal society. Across the border where I grew up, Tuscarora, it's still matrilineal, very traditional, and you get your membership through your mother, and that's the way it's always been. But this Indian Act in 1876 changed that. You get your enrollment through your father, which has never been the way it's been. So it was very patrilineal, patriarchal. They changed a process that, had been in place forever. And all it really did was cause confusion. A lot of people no longer knew what nation they belonged to, what clan they were. Like right now, it's up in the air for me because all my life, my mother said she was Mohawk and she was a Turtle Clan. But now, through a lot of, genealogy and searching, I've found out that at somewhere along the way it got messed up, and really I am Onondaga and Bear Paw Clan. So I might have to change things up here. Um, it introduced residential schools again as a tool to assimilate. Not Well, it wasn't supposed to kill the child and save the or kill the Indian and save the child, but it did. Created reserves, renamed individual with European names, so get rid of all of the Ginyagahaga, the Mohawk. Get rid of every name and use European names. Um, it restricted people from leaving the reserve unless they had a permission slip from the Indian agent. If somebody went to university, they had to get enfranchised, meaning that they lost their membership in their nation, which I don't understand. The government could take pieces of the land anytime they wanted to for roads, for railways, for public works, which is kind of what's going on now, taking a piece of a reserve to run the power lines, hydro through. A lot of leasing of the lands to non-indigenous people who then in the end kept it. Um, just a lot of different things. Prohibited sale of alcohol, sale of ammunition, imposed this band council system in 1924. Here at Six Nations, the RCMP were brought in, and it switched from a traditional government, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, to an elected band council at that time. It was very violent, it was violent. People got hurt. This one, number 15, forbade First Nations from speaking their native language. There's that genocide, linguistic genocide. Forbade First Nations from practicing their traditional religion, beliefs, cultures, songs. Forbade them from wearing their traditional regalia, from being involved in any public dance, shows, exhibitions, anything, wearing their regalia. Whatever cultural ceremonies they had, those were outlawed as illegal. I don't really get this one, how they denied us the right to vote, but yet they said they wanted to assimilate us. So I don't know. So yeah, just a piece of legislation that subjugated us as less than. Historical oppression, a lot of that, a lot of atrocities, a lot of mistreatment. That's what this residential school is. That's the legacy of this residential school. And just, fostered a lot of mistrust for the government. I've heard so many stories of kids who, what they were taught was, if you see a black car coming, if you hear a car coming down the road, you go run to the bush. You go run and hide, because there was a lot of, after they would come and take the children, there was then the 60 scoops where they would just drive through the reserve. Any child walking on the road would just get picked up and taken. Institutionalized racism. Racism is about, and it's getting hard to even talk about that. I think I'll just keep moving. Discrimination. This is a picture of survivors in front of the mush hole here in Brantford at one of the orange shirt days. And I think that this really kind of says it all, that a lot of First Nations, Indigenous peoples have been affected. Either directly, they were either the survivor who attended, or indirectly, they were descendants of survivors. So what happened is, being at a residential school, that broke apart families. They weren't able to speak their language. They weren't able to practice their traditions, their spirituality, and whatever they believed in to be right was told to be wrong. And, they were called pagans and heathens and all kinds of things. I remember being at a conference for psychiatrists, psychologists down in Phoenix, Arizona, and there was a woman there. She was an elder. She got up and she spoke, and she, shared, because there were residential schools in the U.S. too. They called them boarding schools. And she held up her hand, and her little pinky was chopped off from here down. And she told the story that she was still speaking Navajo with her friends, and she got caught again and again. And finally, that was her punishment. They cut the tip of her pinky finger off for speaking her language. Others spoke about getting needles in their tongue, getting put in rooms, with nothing to eat. There's a story in here about Sunday go to meeting clothes. And, my mother would say that, go get on your Sunday go to meeting clothes. And I never knew the genesis of that. And one of the elders from here spoke about how when they kept speaking their language, they would be put in this room that was cold, and all the clothes were there, the Sunday go to meeting clothes, all the good clothes that the kids would put on Sundays to go to the Mohawk Chapel down the road from the Mohawk Institute. And they would just be left in there, for days, hours or days, because they spoke their language. So there's this Hillary Weaver, and there's another woman, Maria Braveheart. They both, talk about that unresolved historical trauma that is part of this residential school experienced. So if your parents or your grandparents went to this residential school, they weren't with their families, they weren't nurtured, they weren't loved, there was just such a big loss. So it was just historical trauma. So any of that unresolved, poorly resolved collective trauma, when you look at communities, like even today, as a social worker, I do therapy every day with people from the reserve here. And I've said it many times that our community is a very sick community. It really is, because there is so much unresolved trauma here that has never been dealt with. And because of that, sometimes that trauma filters down from one generation to the next generation. Sometimes it filters down into the workplace. It's just not healthy. And my biggest concern right now is that at the Mohawk Institute, at the Woodland Cultural Center, they are now searching with ground penetrating radar for those unmarked graves of those children that attended, because there were many children who never came home, whether they were from here or from up north. They never came home. So when that happens, when they start to find those bodies, I think it's going to get worse here. I think my caseload is going to explode, and I am not looking forward to that. I want to tell a little quick story. I know it's in here. It's in here somewhere. When I went to that September 30th event at the Cultural Center, I got there and there was a man who was speaking. And I don't know what language he was speaking, but I don't think it was Ganyagahaga. I don't think it was Gayakono. Gayakono is Cayuga. So he wasn't speaking Mohawk or Cayuga. I think he was Anishinaabe from up north somewhere. And he was speaking, and even though I didn't know what he was saying, I could feel like it just resonated within me. You could feel his voice undulating, as he spoke. Those feelings came out. And when he was done, I think he was saying like the words before all others, that prayer that we speak before we come together as one. And afterwards, he spoke about being at the mush hole for many years and going home back to his reserve up north. He said probably about 16, and he was staying with his grandfather. And it was hard for him because he couldn't speak his language anymore. He could understand it. He could understand what his grandfather was saying, but it was so hard to try to communicate with him because of his loss of his language. And so he spoke about one day, he said to his grandfather, "Grandfather, what is truth?" And his grandfather said, "My boy, truth is like a line that runs from you outward forever, for infinity. That's what truth is." He said, but what is truth? He said, there will be times in your life where you may cross that line and you may know truth in those moments. But when will I know the truth? He said, my boy, you will never know the real truth on this side. And when he said that, I just the whole day was pretty emotional for me. It just kind of, really, really resonated that there was just so much trauma that these children were trying to figure out who they were. Genocide, I had to put this in there because it just, the government is saying that there was no genocide, but if you look at the United Nations articles from that convention, the Geneva Convention, it's here, intent to destroy in whole or in part a national, ethnical, racial, or religious group, that ethnocide. Killing members of the group, how many bodies have we found so far? Over 7,000 between here and the US. Causing serious bodily or mental harm to members of the group. I highlight it and mental harm because I work every day with people who suffer from anxiety, depression, grief. Deliberately calculated to bring its physical destruction in whole or in part. Forced sterilization, that happened, still happening. Forcibly transferring children of one group to another group. Linguistic genocide. I think this is important because, the language a person speaks isn't just communication. It really is a window into the way that we think. our worldview, I believe, is different than the dominant culture. It's a way to transmit values, worldviews, a way of constructing reality. And when native languages were condemned by the Canadian and the US government, it really was about annihilating not just our language, but also our culture, because that's how our culture was transmitted, was through the language. So they say that all of the first speakers, the first language speakers of Tuscarora are gone, where I come from. My father was Tuscarora, and there are my nephew actually has a PhD in linguistics, and he is trying to revitalize the language. There's, a big move to do that, but the first language speakers of Tuscarora have all passed away. So we're just scrambling to try to save the language at this time. Here at Six Nations, I don't have an actual count, but I know that there are still some Mohawk speakers where it was their first language, some Cayuga, some Onondaga. I don't know the numbers. I should. I was actually signed up and I was taking Ganyagahaga language course full time right when I started my job here a couple years ago. But then when the COVID hit and we started going to online Zoom, I just couldn't do it because I have such a, at that time, a bad connection. I'd get kicked off. It'd take me 15, 20 minutes to get back on. I just finally said, no, I can't do this because now with this pandemic, my caseload had exploded and I couldn't work full time and take this language program full time. So I still regret that, but I'm going to get back to it for sure because it's important to me.
Dawn,
Yeah.
oh, sorry. Keep going. No, I didn't know you had a last line. I thought you were finishing up. Please do.
Hold on just a second. Say that again.
I just said I thought you had finished with that last slide, but if there's more, please do continue. Sorry to interrupt.
Oh, okay. I'll just go quickly. Okay, so that's
Okay,
more
Dawn.
about linguistics. What is culture? This picture here of this doll here is made by this lady that I knew when I was a kid, Mildred Garlow. I loved her beadwork. It was always purple. Everything was purple. And that's in my bookcase behind me. And those are just some of the pottery that's made here on this reserve. The ones of clay are from here. The little strawberry basket, that is up from Ohsweken. So culture is about values, attitudes, beliefs, customs, behaviors. It's pretty complex when you think about it. Changing cultural stereotypes. I had to throw that in there. To me, that middle one, a set of beliefs that is incorrectly learned, overgeneralized, factually incorrect, or rigid. For me, I don't believe that people are born racist. I believe that they learn beliefs that are incorrect, Yeah. Cultural competence as a social worker, I threw this in here because I think that this is really important when you are working with people. If there's cross-cultural stuff going on, you really need to understand their culture. And this is just a continuum that that was talked about, and I think it's really important too. Most people are kind of just in this cultural pre-competence, hopefully working our way up to cultural proficiency. I can talk. This picture here is the picture that I saw when I watched that video um, at the Mush Hole in 2017. It was part of the virtual tour that they did, and it was in a room. They were in the middle of these renovations. They had taken down the stairwells that went up to the boys' dormitory on the left side and the girls' dormitory on the right side. So where there was a what do you call that? A landing. This is what was written there. So they took a boom a camera on a boom way up there, and they took this picture, and that third name down on that list is my mother's signature. And when I saw that, and that was in 1937, the day I saw that, I just shattered in that darkened theater. It was, yeah. And this, I'm almost done. I think this is like second to last. So this one is about land. Land is really important, because we have an ongoing relationship with the land. Yeah, the land is a keeper of our bones, our stories, our songs. And so, yeah, in this manner, thinking or being, there isn't a hierarchy. We can't differentiate our values because all things are living, including the land. I remember interviewing a guy when I was still in graduate school. And when he got interviewed, that's where he wanted to be interviewed, was out in his garden. And that's where he talked about the importance of planting his garden, the importance of having his hands in the warm earth in the summertime. That's what he looked forward to, because that's where he felt the the most centered, healed. Been a big push for land-based healing, and that really is about that connectedness, that being on the land, whether it's fishing, whether it's just walking in the woods, feeling the ground under your feet, smelling the earth as you're walking through. Really important, that connection. That's just the Haldeman Proclamation. Yagalundu's storyteller. This is my mother's card that they also sent me a picture of. Hazel Venevri, she was admitted at 9. Her band was Upper Cayuga, and that is wrong because that's what her father is. He's Upper Cayuga, but her mother was either Mohawk or Onondaga. I'm not sure. That's how that changed back and, messed things up. That's my grandpa, my grandma, Titus Venevri, Vera Thomas. Says that she went to number 8 school for 3 years before she got sent there. It says that she absconded twice. It says no punishment, but I doubt that. Discharged August 31st, 1940. Grade 9. Did good. Right from there, she went into the armed services. I had a picture of her in her uniform, but I can't find it. I wanted to put that in here too. And I just, wish that I had paid more attention to the stories that I heard from everybody. I wish I had written more stuff down, because to me, all of this historical knowledge, it really does. It nurtures new stories within my mind. Having heard many, many stories, it just gives me an access within myself, right, to limitless awareness. And I think that's it. Thank you.
Dawn, that was one of the more powerful programs we've ever had on this broadcast. So thank you so much for sharing all that. Having never lived or never having had people in my family history that experienced any of this, I can tell you that it is traumatizing to hear just the same, and that's a sentiment echoed by all of our classrooms that we've had on in many of these Downey Wenjack Fund broadcasts. It's really, it's quite distressing. I mean, there's no way around feeling very just awash with emotion at hearing these stories, and I really want to thank you for sharing them with us today, because I know it's not easy in any way. On that note, actually, Dawn, I am curious, you've had the opportunity to share these stories in person, you've had the chance to talk about them, you've had the chance to write them, and now in this beautiful collection. Does it get easier sharing these stories over time, or harder? I could see it going both ways. How does it impact you personally as you share this with others?
I kind of liken it to EMDR, the rapid eye movement desensitization and processing therapy, because in writing these stories, it seems like it helped me to disconnect emotionally from them. And like when people are triggered to a story, whether it's through, olfactory, they smell something, makes them remember, they hear a song, it makes them remember back to that moment in time. I think by having written these stories out, it's like kind of cut that emotional tether to those moments in time, to those stories, so that they are not so emotionally dysregulating for me anymore. When I used to just think about them without ever processing them, I think it was too much. It was hard. I couldn't deal with it. I couldn't read my son's poem out loud ever. I would just, fall into a heat. But now, the more that I write about it, the more that I talk about it, I think that emotional tether is not so connected. I don't get that, that fight or flight or, fall apart anymore. It's not as bad as it used to be. But it still hurts, it's still there. What she went through, and the fact that she's gone, and I will never know what she went through ever. Maybe on the other side. Or maybe I don't need to know. I don't know.
Sorry. Okay. We're both tearing up together. Don, one of the things that I was personally most interested in over the course of your talk and in your background is that you have this really unique situation where you have this clinical knowledge as a social therapist, where you get to work with people in a wide variety of contexts. And you talked in that answer about the fact that you can sort of use that knowledge to dissociate the emotional component of it from the facts of something and sort of move forward in a positive direction. I don't even know what my question is about that. I find it so interesting that you combine both of those. You sort of have this dual way of looking at these stories that is so unique, both in this Downey Wenjack Fund series and in general that we've ever had on this program. Do you find one informing the other more? Like when you're dealing with people who come to you on a reservation, they have challenges. Do you find yourself applying that same clinical lens to them, or do you find it's more powerful or equally so to be able to share your own personal story in this backdrop of your family? It's so fascinating.
I think that it's kind of, I don't know if it's equal, but it's the fact that, I've lived through kind of what they've lived through, and I have that experiential knowledge base. Add that to what I know, my book knowledge. It one complements the other, and I think it's always been so helpful for me to build a rapport with people because I understand what they've been through, because I have been through the same. So yeah.
Your conscientiousness and empathy shine through in the entire program today, and I have no doubt that applies to your work as well. So it's been an absolute pleasure. In fact, actually, before I go to my next question, I do want to bring up on the screen for anyone, if you want to get Memory Keeper, if you want to learn more about it, I put a link on the bottom of the banner, and I put this in the YouTube chat as well, where you can purchase Memory Keeper and you can see more about it. And I really encourage, if you want to follow up with these stories for our entire audience today. Again, I said to you before the broadcast, 27 classes across the continent. Register today. No pressure. But I really do encourage everyone to get that, especially with Christmas coming up. If you want something to get a read that's really powerful and important nowadays in Canada more than ever, I can't recommend that highly enough. Dawn,
Yeah.
you highlighted the importance of language, sort of bringing back these traditions that were lost or stifled for so long. And I must say, as we move as a country towards more cultural competency, one of the big things that I've noticed is this overwhelming push to showcase these cultural stories, dances, and languages. You began your talk today talking in your native language, and I think this is such a beautiful thing. First of all, I really hope you get the chance to continue those courses soon. In-person stuff is back, or it's coming back slowly but surely. Is there something for our classes today, and for people tuning into this broadcast, what would you recommend they do as they leave this session to increase their own cultural competency, whether it's read something or go do something? Is there anything that jumps out as being particularly important or salient?
I find a lot of information, on the internet. There's so much out there. You just can, plug in what is the worst thing about the Indian Act? What is the best thing about the Indian Act? I didn't even talk about, and I meant to talk about, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. I would really recommend that they look into that. There are 94 calls to action. Now, those calls to action are not recommendations. They have to be done. They should be done. And right now, 9 of them have been done. That's it, out of 94. And this was from 2015, so 6 years ago. Not much, has been accomplished. So maybe go in there and see what is it that they could help work on to get a call to action up and running. Look through there, look through the book. I think they get a book in their kit, don't they? Of that little book of Truth and Reconciliation Commission. I know I have one. Just a little orange book.
We'll make sure that classes have those resources. I'm going to link the Truth and Reconciliation Commission and those 94 calls to action on the YouTube chat. So if people want to check that out, they can do that. So, I mean, this is something, you're not the first person in this series to mention the 9 of 94, which is a troublingly small number. It's under 10% of what we have promised. Now, on a positive note, it's been interesting to see this huge shift towards program series like this, the huge shift to Truth and Reconciliation Day, the huge positive. Do you personally find that the stuff that has been done so far is a noteworthy positive shift, or is it just not even remotely enough? Is it I don't know. I'm curious what your thought is. Everyone's had a very different answer to this over the course of our series.
Well, I, just recently, there's a young man from here, Skylar Williams, and he was the person who was kind of the leader behind this land back lane recently in the past couple of years, where in Caledonia, it really is about, the Haldeman Tract and trying to hang on to that land and preserve it for, our next 7 generations. And so there was a big pushback on that. And then recently he's gone out to be, with the Wet'suwet'en, who too are having their land taken and used, and, the natural resources, and I want to say this, that it's 2021, and we're still facing this racism, this institutionalized systemic racism. Skylar stated just this week that he got arrested out there at the Wet'suwet'en territory in British Columbia. They put him in a dog cage. They brought him to court in his underwear. Like, how dehumanizing, how devaluing, how could they treat a man, whether that man is Haudenosaunee, which means, people of the Longhouse, Angwehoi, original people, Ginyagehaga, Mohawk man. How do they treat that man, a man like that? How do you do that? Treating them like an animal. It reminds me of the Nazis who, they used all their propaganda to make people believe that Jewish people were, lower than the fleas on the dog's belly. That's what they're using, that propaganda, and it's going on today. He's being treated like that today. How can that be? What about this Truth and Reconciliation Commission? What about these calls to action? Yeah, where's the change? Nothing changes if nothing changes.
To bring it back to the earlier point, that empathy and conscientiousness that has pervaded this talk from your stories, it is something that is an important thing in every element of dealing with other people. And I think that, whether you take that as an understanding just instinctually, a lot of kids these days are of course fantastic about this. One of the things that we always like to highlight is the fact that, whether the changes in society over the last 20 years have been truly substantial in terms of the broader recognition of more different ways of being, more different ways of living, acceptance of skin colors, creeds, religions, the sexual orientations, and more. And I think that it's extremely troubling. You hit the nail on the head by saying it's 2021.
Mm-hmm.
When that can be your statement about the way that people are being treated, I think it's a wake-up call and a call to action, and a very, very important thing to note for our students today, and for anyone who might be tuning in both on our channel, Downey Wenjack Fund, and beyond. And so if we're to end with the idea that there's a lot more empathy to go around in the world, and there's a lot of meaningful action that still needs to be taken, I think that that's an important call for our students. And again, for the purposes of today's broadcast, to highlight Memory Keeper, I do encourage people to see those stories. The only way you can move towards this meaningful reconciliation that this series is all about is to be culturally competent, to understand what has happened in the past and understand what is happening now, and act accordingly. And so, Dawn, I do just want to thank you so very much as our hour draws to a close, for sharing with us today. And I really hope our students follow up and keep the learning going long after this is done. So thank you so very much.
No.
Yep.
Which is, you're welcome.
We will end our live